127 prehistoric, screeching birds. That was the exact count when Ruth backed her rusted Ford F-150 up to the barn. Neighbors called her crazy. They called the local ordnance board. But when the bloodsuckers emptied out the county's cattle pastures, nobody was laughing anymore. They were begging. Dust hung in the dead August air like powdered cement. Ruth cut the engine of the pickup. The silence of her farm lasted exactly 3 seconds before the bed of the truck erupted. It wasn't a chirp or a cluck. It was a metallic, grating shriek, amplified by 100 throats, rattling against the wooden slats of the jury-rigged transport crates. Rick, the county animal control officer, stepped out of the passenger side. He wiped a ring of sweat from the inside of his collar, looking at the dilapidated barn and then back at the vibrating crates. "I still think you're out of your mind, Ruth," Rick said. He didn't smile. He looked exhausted, carrying the weight of a man who spent his week dealing with other people's neglected messes. 127. You couldn't just take a dozen? Or none? They're going to eat you out of house and home, and what they don't eat, they're gonna deafen. Ruth didn't answer right away. She walked to the tailgate, her heavy work boots crunching on the dry gravel. She unlatched the heavy metal hook. "You said they were going to the incinerator, Rick. I told you I had the space. That's the end of the transaction." She wasn't a savior. Ruth wouldn't have called herself an animal lover, either. She was a 60-year-old widow, running 50 acres of dry, unforgiving scrubland that barely grew weeds, let alone a profitable crop. Since her husband passed 4 years ago, the farm had slowly emptied out. First the hogs, then the few heads of Angus, sold off to pay medical debts. The silence of the property had become a heavy, physical thing. It pressed on her eardrums at night. When Rick had mentioned the bust, a backyard hoarder 2 towns over, operating an illegal breeding setup and leaving a massive flock of guinea fowl to starve, Ruth had simply raised her hand. They lowered the first crate to the dirt. The smell hit them instantly. Ammonia, stale feathers, and panic. Through the wire mesh, hundreds of dark, beady eyes stared out. Guinea fowl are not pretty birds. They look like a cruel joke of evolution. Part vulture, part partridge, with bald, bony heads, stark white skin patches, and slate-grey bodies covered in endless white polka dots. They paced frantically, throwing their bodies against the wire. "All right," Ruth muttered. "Let 'em out." Rick popped the latch and jumped back. A grey tidal wave poured into the barnyard. The sheer volume of the noise was physical. Buckwheat! 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 The alarm call of the Guinea hen is designed to carry across the African savanna. Multiplied by 127, it was a localized sonic weapon. They scattered like dropped marbles, running with their heads low and their bodies perfectly horizontal, kicking up clouds of dry earth. "Good God," Rick muttered, plugging an ear with his index finger. "Your neighbors are going to lynch you." "I don't have neighbors," Ruth said, watching the flock immediately begin pecking at the dry dirt, establishing a chaotic perimeter. "I have people who happen to live on the other side of a barbed wire fence. There's a difference." She was talking about Jim Caldwell. Jim owned the sprawling 300-acre cattle operation bordering her eastern property line. He drove a King Ranch truck he bought with a subsidized agricultural loan and treated the county line like his personal fiefdom. By the time Rick's truck disappeared down the driveway, the dust hadn't even settled before a silver four-wheeler crested the ridge. Jim. He killed the engine by the fence line and crossed his arms, staring at the grey horde swarming Ruth's pasture. Even from 50 yards away, Ruth could see the deep scowl etching into his sun-leathered face. He didn't wave. He didn't yell. He just stared. Ruth didn't acknowledge him. She picked up an empty crate, tossed it into the barn, and walked inside. The first few nights were an adjustment. Guineas don't roost in coops if they can help it. They belong to the trees. As dusk settled, the flock staged a noisy, uncoordinated assault on the ancient oak tree towering over Ruth's house. Branches groaned under the weight of dozens of fat, heavy-bodied birds. They argued over sleeping spots, shrieking into the twilight, completely ignoring the perfectly good, predator-proof barn Ruth had prepared. She sat on her porch with a mug of black coffee, watching them. They were stupid. They were loud. They were ugly. But as she listened to the chaotic rustling above her roof, the oppressive, hollow silence that had haunted her farm for 4 years was gone, replaced by the restless energy of something alive. The next morning, the real trouble started. Guineas do not respect property lines. They don't understand barbed wire. To a guinea hen, the world is one endless, bug-filled buffet, and by sunrise, half the flock had marched straight through the fence and into Jim Caldwell's pristine front lawn. Ruth was pouring her second cup of coffee when the phone on the kitchen wall screamed, "Ruth, it's Jim!" The voice on the other end was tight, vibrating with restrained fury. "Morning, Jim. I have 50 ugly, screeching buzzards currently shitting on my wife's hydrangeas and terrorizing my barn cats. You have exactly 20 minutes to get them off my land before I get my shotgun and start treating them like clay pigeons." Ruth sighed. She rubbed the bridge of her nose. "They eat bugs, Jim. They're just foraging. They'll wander back when they get thirsty." 20 minutes, Ruth. The line went dead. She walked out onto the porch. Down in the valley, she could see the grey swarm moving across Jim's manicured grass. The faint, grating sound of their alarm calls drifted on the wind. She grabbed a bucket of cracked corn and began the long, humiliating walk down the hill. This was only day 2. The battle lines were drawn, and 127 oblivious foot soldiers were already invading enemy territory. June arrived with a vengeance. The heat didn't just warm the earth, it baked it hard, cracking the clay and turning the tall pasture grass into brittle yellow spears. The humidity rolled in from the river, trapping the heat under a wet, suffocating blanket. And the guineas thrived. They were creatures of the heat, practically vibrating with energy, while the rest of the county wilted. Their daily routine became a strict, military-style patrol. At dawn, they dropped from the oak tree like overripe fruit, hitting the ground with heavy thuds before organizing into distinct platoons. They moved shoulder to shoulder, sweeping through the tall grass, their heads darting down with mechanical precision. Peck, peck, swallow. But their patrols inevitably took them off Ruth's land. They loved the asphalt of the county road, turning it into a warm resting spot and completely blocking the postal truck. They loved Betty Lou's vegetable garden 2 miles down the road, treating her heirloom tomatoes like bright red bowling pins. Mostly, though, they loved Jim Caldwell's cattle feed bunks. The town of Oakhaven turned on Ruth quickly. Small towns don't tolerate eccentricities that disrupt the peace, and 127 guineas were the definition of a disruption. On a Tuesday, Ruth walked into the local hardware store to buy fencing staples. The low hum of conversation at the counter died the second the bell on the door chimed. Jim Caldwell was leaning against the register, a cup of complimentary coffee in his hand. Next to him was Greg, the town mechanic, and Betty Lou. "Hear that?" Jim asked the room, cupping a hand to his ear. "Huh. Quiet. Funny how nice quiet sounds." Greg snorted. Betty Lou aggressively inspected a rack of gardening gloves, refusing to look at Ruth. Ruth ignored them. She walked to the back aisle, picked up 2 boxes of heavy-duty staples, and carried them to the counter. The teenage clerk looked terrified. "Put it on my tab, Billy," Ruth said, staring straight ahead. Jim didn't move from the register. He shifted his weight, blocking her path slightly. I'm putting a petition together, Ruth. Noise ordinance violation, public nuisance, agricultural hazard. I've got 30 signatures already. Folks are tired of waking up at 5 in the morning to the sound of a slaughterhouse. Those birds of yours chased the Schuler boy on his bicycle yesterday. They don't chase, Jim, Ruth said, her voice flat, devoid of the apology he was fishing for. They run in the same direction. They're flock animals. I don't give a damn about their psychology, Jim snapped, his face flushed, the veins in his neck pressing against his collar. Keep them locked up, or I'm having the sheriff out to confiscate them. You're bringing down the whole valley with this hoarding nonsense. Ruth paid for her staples and walked out. The silence in the store followed her all the way to her truck. She knew they were right to be annoyed. She spent half her days chasing the flock, trying to mend fences that the birds simply walked through, but she wouldn't back down. The flock had become a strange anchor for her. They were survivors. Unwanted, loud, entirely unlovable, but they refused to die. She respected that. But while the town was entirely focused on the noise above ground, they were missing the silent invasion happening in the grass below. It started subtly. The mild winter and early, wet spring had created a perfect storm. The tall grass that lined the county roads and the deep pastures of Jim Caldwell's ranch was teeming. Jim first noticed it on his prize heifers. He was running a herd of purebred Charolais, massive, beautiful, cream-colored cattle that were his pride and joy. Late in June, he was walking the fence line when he noticed one of the calves lagging. Its head was low. When he approached, the calf barely moved. Jim ran a hand along the calf's neck and stopped. It felt like gravel beneath the white hide. He parted the fur. Ticks, not just a few. The calf's skin was paved with them. Hundreds of swollen, grey bodies, engorged with blood, clustering tightly around the ears, the neck, and the soft skin of the belly. Jim cursed, stepping back. He looked down at his own jeans. From his boots to his knees, a shimmering, crawling wave of tiny brown seed ticks was migrating upward. He spent the next 3 hours in his barn with a stiff brush and a bottle of permethrin, scrubbing his boots and clothes. Within a week, the subtle problem became a plague. It was the Lone Star tick, aggressive and fast. The local vet's phone didn't stop ringing. Dogs were coming in lethargic, crippled by tick paralysis. Cattle were dropping weight at an alarming rate, losing blood faster than they could replenish it. The massive herds spent their days stamping their feet in the dust, exhausted, swatting at ears that were heavy with parasites. The hardware store sold out of chemical sprays, dips, and foggers in 2 days. Men in Tyvek suits drove tractors with massive spray tanks across the pastures, coating the earth in poison. But the grass was too deep, the acreage too vast, and the ticks were already entrenched. At the diner, the complaints about Ruth's guineas vanished, replaced by hushed, panicked conversations about anemia, vet bills, and alpha-gal syndrome. The meat allergy passed through the tick's bite. Greg, the mechanic, was hospitalized after pulling an engorged tick from his shoulder. 3 days later, he was covered in hives, his throat swelling shut after eating a hamburger. Fear replaced annoyance. People stopped walking in their yards. Kids were kept indoors. The lush green pastures of Oakhaven suddenly looked like hostile territory. Through it all, Ruth's farm remained untouched. She didn't use chemicals. She couldn't afford them, even if she wanted to. But as she watched Jim Caldwell spray thousands of gallons of pesticide across the property line, coughing in the heavy fog, she noticed something. Her ancient yellow lab, Buster, spent his entire day sleeping in the tall grass by the barn. Every evening, Ruth ran her hands over his coat. Nothing. Not a single tick. She looked out at the pasture. The 127 grey birds were moving in their relentless, disciplined line. peck, peck, swallow. They didn't just eat bugs. They were a biological vacuum. A single guinea fowl could consume up to 4,000 ticks a day. Ruth had an army of 127, sweeping her 50 acres day in and day out. The plague was stopping at her fence line, but the guineas, notoriously ignorant of borders, were about to take the fight to the enemy. July brought no relief, only a dry, punishing wind that scattered the chemical sprays before they could settle on the grass. Jim Caldwell was losing a war of attrition. Sweat dripped from his chin, stinging the raw, scratched skin of his neck. He stood in the holding pen behind his main barn, watching Dr. Harris, the county veterinarian, pull a thick needle from the neck of a trembling Charolais calf. The animal's coat, usually a brilliant, healthy white, looked like dirty wool. Its ribs pushed sharply against its flanks. "That's the last of the oxytetracycline," Dr. Harris said, dropping the empty syringe into a red biohazard bucket. He stripped off his latex gloves. They were smeared with rust-colored blood. "I've got another case of it coming from the distributor on Thursday, but I can't promise it'll be enough, Jim. They're dropping too fast." Jim rubbed his face with calloused hands, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. "I've sprayed every acre, Doc. I've run them through the permethrin dip trough twice this week. It's burning their skin, and the bugs are still latching on. Chemicals only work if you can break the life cycle." Dr. Harris leaned against the steel rails of the pen, looking out over the massive expanse of Jim's property. "You've got 300 acres of tall grass bordering timberland. The deer carry the adults in, the females drop off, and they lay 3,000 eggs apiece in the brush. By the time your spray kills one generation, the next is already crawling up the stalks. It's a numbers game. Right now, they outnumber you 1,000,000 to 1. Jim didn't say anything. He just watched the calf stumble toward the water trough, its legs shaking. 5 calves had died since Monday. 2 full-grown cows were down in the lower pasture, too weak from blood loss to stand. If he lost the breeding stock, the bank would step in by October. The agricultural loan he'd taken out to expand his herd was a heavy chain around his neck, and the links were pulling tight. He left the barn and climbed into his four-wheeler. He needed to check the fence line down in the valley. Driving across his own land felt like crossing a minefield. Jim kept his boots tucked tightly against the engine block, paranoid about brushing against the tall fescue. The psychological toll of the infestation was worse than the physical one. Every itch on his leg, every tickle of sweat rolling down his back, made his heart spike. He showered 3 times a day, scrubbing his skin raw with coarse soap, waking up in the middle of the night convinced he felt tiny legs moving in his hair. He parked near the eastern property line, where his land met Ruth's 50 acres. The barbed wire here was old, rusting and sagging in the middle. Silence hung heavy over his side of the fence. The cattle had abandoned this pasture entirely, retreating to the dirt lots near the barn to avoid the grass. But on the other side of the wire, it was chaos. Buckwheat. Buckwheat! The grey horde was working. Jim cut the engine and just watched them. He hated those birds. He hated their bald, prehistoric heads. He hated the way they sounded like a rusty gate swinging in a storm. Yet there was a strange, hypnotic rhythm to their movement. They weren't just wandering aimlessly. They moved in a V formation, like a flock of geese on the ground. The lead birds plunged into the thickest patches of weeds, their heads violently pistoning up and down. They didn't miss an inch of soil. When the leaders tired, they fell back, and the birds on the flanks pushed forward, seamlessly rotating the vanguard. It was a relentless, biological machine, fueled purely by appetite. Jim watched as a dozen of the birds slipped right through the sagging strands of barbed wire, entering his property. Normally, this would be the moment he reached for his phone to scream at Ruth. Today, he just sat there. He watched them march into a patch of overgrown switchgrass that he knew was swarming with seed ticks. The birds didn't flinch. They didn't scratch. They just ate. The snapping of their beaks was audible, a rapid, percussive clicking that sounded like a heavy rain hitting dry leaves. Curiosity overrode his pride. Jim stepped off the four-wheeler. He walked slowly toward the fence line, stopping exactly where the guineas had just cleared a 10-foot radius on his side of the wire before getting spooked by his approach and retreating back to Ruth's land. He looked down at his boots. Nothing crawled on the leather. He knelt, his knees pressing into the dirt. He parted the tall switchgrass with his bare hands. Yesterday, doing this would have resulted in 100 angry, pin-sized parasites swarming his wrists. Today he saw bare dirt, a few crushed beetles, and the exposed roots of the fescue. He ran his hand along the stems of the grass. Clean. Completely, immaculately clean. Jim stood up slowly. He looked across the valley. Ruth's 50 acres were a barren, dusty patch of scrubland compared to his lush ranch. But her grass was safe. His grass was a death trap. He looked back at his barn in the distance, thinking about the blood-stained gloves, the staggering calves, and the heavy red biohazard bucket. Then he looked back at the flock, currently dusting themselves in a patch of dry dirt, looking completely ridiculous and utterly oblivious to the plague suffocating the county. Pride was a stubborn thing. It was the foundation most ranchers built their lives on. But pride didn't pay the bank, and pride didn't cure anemia. Jim pulled his phone from his chest pocket. He stared at Ruth's contact name for a long, quiet minute. The cynical part of him hated what he was about to do. He shoved the phone back into his pocket without dialing. A phone call wasn't going to cut it. This required walking into the lion's den, or rather, the buzzard's roost. He turned the key on the four-wheeler, threw it into gear, and drove straight toward Ruth's driveway. Dust kicked up behind Jim's tires as he pulled into Ruth's yard. Buster, the ancient yellow lab, thumped his tail once against the porch floorboards, but didn't bother lifting his head. Ruth was sitting in a faded lawn chair, a mug in her hand, watching him approach. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look smug, either. She just looked tired, a woman carrying the weight of a quiet, empty house. Jim killed the engine. He didn't strut. He didn't lean aggressively against his vehicle. He took his hat off, holding it by the brim in both hands. "Ruth," he said, his voice stripped of its usual booming authority. It sounded raspy, worn down by weeks of stress and chemical fumes. "Jim," she replied flatly, "you here with that petition?" Jim looked down at his boots, then back up. "I lost 5 calves this week. 2 more cows probably won't make it through the night. The vet is out of antibiotics and the dips aren't working. The ticks are bleeding them dry." Ruth stayed silent. She took a slow sip of her coffee. She knew how much it cost a man like Jim Caldwell to stand on her porch and admit defeat. "I walked the east fence line an hour ago," Jim continued, gesturing vaguely over his shoulder. "Where your birds have been trespassing. The grass is clear. It's the only clean patch of grass on my entire 300 acres. "They have a high metabolism," Ruth said evenly. "They need to eat." Jim took a deep breath. "I need them to eat on my side of the fence, Ruth. All of them. I'll open the main gates. I'll cut the bottom wires. I don't care about the noise. I don't care about my wife's hydrangeas. Let them run." Ruth finally set her mug down on the wooden railing. She looked past Jim, toward the massive oak tree where the flock was currently staging a loud, disorganized squabble over a dead grasshopper. They were a chaotic, shrieking mess. "They don't take orders, Jim. I can't just point them at your cattle and tell them to get to work." But they follow the food, Jim pressed, stepping closer to the porch. If I stop chasing them off, if I stop shooting over their heads to scare them, they'll push deeper into my property. You know they will. They're greedy. Ruth allowed a tiny, grim smile to touch the corners of her mouth. That they are. Please, Jim said. It was the first time Ruth had ever heard the word cross his lips. I'll pay for their feed in the winter. I'll drop the petition. Just let them cross the line. Ruth stood up. She wiped her hands on her jeans. Go open your gates, Jim, and tell your wife to put chicken wire around her flower beds, because they won't spare the hydrangeas. By noon, the physical barriers between the two properties were gone. Jim had driven his tractor down the fence line, dragging the heavy metal gates wide open and securing them with heavy chain. It didn't take long for the vanguard to notice. A squad of 10 guineas approached the open gate cautiously. They stretched their scrawny necks, eyeing the vast, untouched ocean of deep fescue on Jim's side. The clicking began. A low, vibrating hum of anticipation. One bird stepped across the threshold, then another. Then the alarm sounded. Buckwheat! Buckwheat! It wasn't a warning. It was a dinner bell. The sound echoed back to Ruth's yard. Instantly, the entire flock mobilized. 127 prehistoric, slate-grey birds poured through the gates like water through a broken dam. They didn't run wildly. They hit the tall grass and immediately fanned out, forming a massive, sweeping crescent. Jim sat on the hood of his truck, watching them. The noise was deafening. They chattered, shrieked, and hissed as they worked. But as he watched them move through the pasture, parting the grass and plunging their beaks into the earth with machine gun rapidity, the harsh sound began to change in his mind. It no longer sounded like a slaughterhouse. It sounded like a rescue cavalry. The change didn't happen overnight. But within 10 days, the tide broke. The Guineas cleared the lower valley first, systematically dismantling the tick population. They worked tirelessly from dawn until dusk, gorging themselves until their crops bulged against their chests. Once the lower valley was clear, Jim drove his herd down, moving them out of the infested upper pastures. The cattle, exhausted and anemic, finally found relief. They stopped stamping. They started grazing. News travels fast in a dying town. When Betty Lou drove by and saw Jim Caldwell tossing cracked corn onto his own driveway to keep the Guineas close to his barn, the town's group chat exploded. Greg the mechanic was the next to ask. He showed up at Ruth's house with a bruised ego and a basket of fresh vegetables, asking if he could borrow a dozen birds for his backyard. Ruth told him they weren't property to be lent, but she conveniently left her road gate open. By late August, the heat broke, and the tick population crashed entirely. The county vet reported a massive drop in tick-borne illnesses. Oakhaven hadn't been saved by a chemical miracle or government intervention. It had been saved by a noisy, unwanted flock of scavengers that no one else had the stomach to keep. The birds didn't magically become graceful or quiet. They still blocked the mail truck. They still ruined flower beds. But when the screeching echoed across the valley at dawn, nobody reached for the sheriff's number. Ruth sat on her porch as the autumn air moved in, cooling her coffee. The silence that used to suffocate her farm was permanently gone, replaced by the grating, ugly, beautiful sound of 127 survivors claiming their territory. She took a sip of her coffee, watching them swarm a fallen branch. They were still hideous, but they were hers. Sometimes the ugliest, loudest solutions are exactly the ones we need to survive the silent plagues. Ruth didn't set out to save her town, but nature has a funny way of balancing the scales when we finally step back and let it work. If this grounded, gritty story of unexpected survival struck a chord with you, hit that like button. Share it with someone who appreciates the messy side of farming. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the untamed realities of rural life.